there something you needed to?
Yeah, I'm supposed to say.
You're introducing me? Or?
Yeah, they gave me a script.
Oh, cool. All right, great. Go for it.
Oh, do you put an accent on your name anywhere?
No,
Lawrence?
no, just whatever you want is fine.
Okay. So, William Lawrence has been teaching ESL, writing, speech, and psychology courses for more than 20 years. He holds a master's degree in TESOL from Temple University and undergraduate degrees in communication and psychology. He's currently a lecturer at the Department of English at Hawai'i Community College, and he's previously taught in Japan, Hong Kong, and Seattle. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome William Lawrence.
Thank you. Wow, such a nice welcome. Well, everything you said is true, but before I start, I just want to tell you that I'm facing my greatest challenge as a language teacher right now. Okay, not here, but at home. So I have a 2-year-old at home, and he's starting to learn how to speak, and I'm really worried that maybe he'll talk wrong, and then I'll have to change jobs or something because I don't think I could face that. So I'm hoping that teaching experience will turn out all right, because I think as a language teacher, I feel very accountable to that. But fortunately, my wife is there, and I know that she'd take the blame if it came to that, so that's good. What I wanted to talk about today was, 5 basic ideas that have helped me as a teacher to enable my students I think, to be more successful language learners. And so I just want to spend a few minutes with you talking about those ideas and telling you how I put them into practice, and some of the ideas that I try and keep in mind as I prepare my lessons and as I work with my students. And I'm sure with this distinguished group, many of you probably have better ideas than I do, but perhaps we can just start a conversation about that, and perhaps today I'll have a chance to learn a little bit from you as well. So to get started, let's just talk for a few minutes about just a couple of ideas about language development. You might notice you've probably seen something about this. Recently, a lot of parents have gotten into the habit of teaching their kids sign language before they're able to speak. And I'm working with an interpreter in one of my classes, one of my reading classes, and there's some hard of hearing students in that class. And she told me that with her child, before the child was 1 year old, she had a 400-word vocabulary using sign, which I think is just remarkable. So that child definitely has a head start on the world. But vocabulary to me, the reason it interests me is because I believe it's the DNA of our language, and that if we can assist our students in acquiring as much vocabulary as possible, as quickly as possible, we're giving them a good start in being successful language learners in English. So just, these are statistics that you may be familiar with, but let's see here, I don't want to help, do I? On the average, after the age of 1 year old, we acquire about 1,000 words a year of productive vocabulary. Now, this number is actually kind of controversial because I've seen some researchers that say as many as 3,500 words a year after age of 1. So, but if you look at the bulk of the studies, a good average would be to say about 1,000 words a year. And so what that means is that by the time students come to us in university, they have somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000 word vocabulary. Now, I think that the main reason that there's a big gap in that is whether we're looking at productive vocabulary or receptive vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary is much easier to recall and to use, and essentially, I think if it's about 2.2 times more vocabulary for receptive than it is for productive. So I think that's the reason why there's a big gap in the numbers. But if you follow the other guide, they're saying that university students have something like a 60,000 word vocabulary level, which I don't necessarily agree with. In my experience, this seems to be pretty accurate. I've tested students up to the 30,000 word level, and that seems to be pretty accurate in my mind. And the average EFL learner, and this is where it impacts us, after 5 years of studying 5 days a week in a EFL classroom in their home country, they usually develop about a 2,000 word vocabulary after 5 years. Okay? So what that typically means is when these students come to us, we usually, or most of us I'm sure teaching university level students, they come over, they start out with about 2,000 words. And if you've done any testing in vocabulary levels, you probably have found the same thing that I have. That's a pretty accurate number. But what this means to me is that there's an enormous gap, between having a mastered the first 2,000 words and 20,000 words. That's a huge gap. So, it's a big concern that we have is how do we get our students up to a level where that they are functional in the English, so they have enough vocabulary that they can handle the tasks that they have to face, whatever those might be, professionally or personally. So, what do we do about that? Where do we begin? Well, in my case, I have a little saying that I go by that kind of informs a lot of my teaching, and that is this. I feel like if something has to be measurable if we want to change something. And I think it's a common sense idea, but I think a lot of us sometimes we lose sight of that when we're really busy. If we can't look at that data, we can't see where people are at and where they're going, then we don't have any way of really realistically making a meaningful change. And so that's why I'm kind of excited about using frequency lists. Now, I think this has gotten a lot of attention in the last 10, 15 years. But previous to that, it was kind of a new idea. And I'm just curious, in this room here, how many people are familiar with the academic word list or vocabulary frequency list? Okay, it looks like most of you. And that is surprising because, not because you know that, but because outside of the ESL community, the TESOL community, a lot of people don't know that. I have had the opportunity to teach K through 12, public and private school, as well as at the university level in ESL. And what I found is that there's teachers outside of the TESOL community are not really familiar with frequency lists. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when I was teaching in Hong Kong at a K through 12 school, since I was the resident language person, the K through 8 division invited me to come to a meeting, and they were working on implementing this large, comprehensive, rather expensive vocabulary program for the students. They're going to roll it out the next year, and they said, could you give us a little input? So I sat in the back and I listened to the talk about this program, and I looked at the literature and I looked through it. And the thing that was clearly missing from my point of view was there was not a single mention from anybody about where those words come from or why the school wanted to focus on those particular words. And to me that seems like a no-brainer, so I just kind of raised my hand and I said, just curious, does anybody know, including the rep that was there, I said, do you know why they chose these particular words or what list they came from or anything like that? There's this long silence in the room, where we kind of looked around. And I was a little embarrassed, but they kind of said, well, we'll have to look into that, and then they implemented the program. So this is kind of typical. But I think, there is, I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and it's too bad that, inside the TESOL community, we don't exchange this. Because I think the frequency lists are a good example of an area where we've really contributed to that conversation. And just for example, I've been reviewing a few textbooks recently for classes, and I find the same issue. Here's a book that I looked at this past week, and it's a good text. It has a lot of good practice activities, and I don't really have any argument with it. But again, there's not a single word about where this vocabulary comes from. I found that to be true of most of the texts that I've looked at outside of the ESL community. And doesn't that encourage you a little bit? Because sometimes I think we in the TESOL community are sometimes looked at as the orphan children of academia. And we're kind of sitting on the floor underneath the banquet table of pedagogy waiting for scraps to fall in so we could inform our teaching or something like that. And that's just not true. We do have a lot of things we can contribute. But in short, frequency list just tells us that there are certain words that we encounter more frequently than others in our day-to-day interaction with English. And so a high frequency word is one that you might encounter, the ones at the top lists, the first 1,000 words or 2,000 words. Those are going to be the words that you're going to run into the most often, maybe daily. When you pick up a newspaper, when you listen to the news, when you have a conversation, those are the most frequently used words. A low frequency word, on the other hand, as you get farther on the list to the 10,000 word level, the 15,000 or the 30,000 word level, these are words that people might encounter once a year in English, so they might encounter them once in a lifetime or never. And so it is really important that we look carefully at these vocabulary lists because they do inform us about where our students are at and where they can go, where they can make some progress. So as the data tells us, or the research shows us, that the 2,000 most common words in the English language covers about 80% of the content that we would find in any particular text or selection that we would choose. But on the other hand, the research also shows us that 95% is needed to have a full comprehension of a selection. So again, we're seeing this gap. That's the gap that we're really trying to close when we're working with our students. As we said, they come in with probably the first 2,000 words. They probably have pretty good competency with that. And so what we need to do is close that gap between 80% and 95% so that they're able to move on and move on to other things. Now, fortunately, we have a bit of a shortcut because the academic word list, which is another list that's been refined from the frequency lists, there's about 570 words in this list, and these are the most frequently used words in academic texts. So what they've done is they've just culled the language from many textbooks at the college level, and then they came up with the frequency list based on those. So if we can take the time and we can focus on those 570 words, what we've just done is given our students the equivalent as if they had mastered the first 4,000 words in a selection. So my advice is that if you want to fill up that gap, let's focus on the academic word list. Now, there's, like I said, the problem I run into is that very few texts outside of the ESL community are really focused on that. But here's a book that I just found recently. It's a cent gauge book, and this one is just about the AOL list. That's all, and it has a lot of great activity, really well done. So if you're looking for a book that just focuses on the academic word list, like I am, this is a pretty good one that I found. And there's several, but this is one that I particularly like and plan to use. Let's see if I can put that here so you can have a look at it. The author is Helen Huntley. And there it is. And I think that's a very good text to use. Now, when we're assessing vocabulary levels, there's a few things that we should keep in mind. The first thought I had was we should keep in mind that receptive vocabulary is usually retained at about two and a half times more than productive vocabulary. So it's important that we distinguish between those two things, whether it's receptive or productive. And that seems like common sense, but when we're measuring levels, for example, if you do one of the Paul Nation vocabulary levels tests, students generally score very high on the matching type activities. But when it comes down to context, if they do a context-based test, a productive test, they score much lower. And so we need to take that into account when we're preparing activities or when we're thinking about what we want to do. And what I often find is that some learners come in and particularly students from Asia often have very large vocabularies. They're very good at memorizing things, and they're used to doing that, and so they might have an enormous vocabulary. So they might come out as looking like they have a very high-level vocabulary, but in fact, what happens is they're missing a lot of the social cues that come along with the vocabulary and collocations. For example, how which words we often use together, like safe house, safe haven, and so on. And so we need to, in this case, if we get a group that tests like that, you want to help them try and focus in on the social conventions. And perhaps all of you have the experience of sitting in your classroom and having your students use some words that are perhaps not entirely appropriate for the setting. And that's a good teaching moment. You can sit down and explain that so they don't embarrass themselves when it really counts. So the takeaway is, when we test, we just need to make sure that the test is matching the goals of what we're trying to accomplish with our teaching. This is a list that I use a lot. This is from Paul Nation, from a book he wrote in 1990. And this is his knowing a word list. And if you're not familiar with it, I think it's a great list. And it, to me, this is my syllabus right here. Okay. So when I'm focusing on teaching vocabulary, these are the things that I keep in mind in whatever activities we're doing. And I want to try and, of course, we want to hit as many of these things as possible. But as we go along, you can start out with a couple of them, and then you can move forward as you go along. So some of these skills, for example, spelling is looking at the structural part of the language. And then if you add in a dictation with the word, then you're looking at more the phonemic part of learning a language. And when you get down to synonyms and associations and some of the other cognitive type things, we're looking at some of the semantic meanings of the language. And some of these are high demand and some of these are low demand tasks. And so I like to kind of divide them up to kind of distribute the burden a little bit on my students. So this is just a very simple, this is how I might approach teaching this vocabulary list. I like flashcards. I encourage my students to use electronic stuff whenever possible, but for vocabulary, I really like using flashcards because it gives you so much flexibility. And they get kind of cranky because they don't want to haul those cards around and so on, but it really is useful. And at the end of the day, you can add things to it, and they can test each other, and they can play games with it, and there's all kinds of things that you can do. But one thing that I do, the very first time I introduce a set of vocabulary, is I keep in mind that we want to get between 5 and 7 repetitions with a set of vocabulary to get started. Okay? That's kind of the minimum number of repetitions that a student needs to remember the word. And remember that the more repetitions a student can do, the easier it will be for them to recall the word later. When they have to relearn what they've forgotten, it reduces the load, the time it takes them to relearn vocabulary that they've forgotten. So that's kind of a useful idea. So I might begin by dictating a part of the word list. And here's just a quick sample of, here's a word list that I've used. This is just from the academic word list, and you can see I divided up by days. I say Monday, Tuesday, I wanted to cover the first 20 words. Wednesday, they cover the next 20 words, and Friday, they finish it off. Look at some 2 days per set of vocabulary. And 570 words, that's a very obtainable goal if the students are willing to push themselves. That's very obtainable in a semester. You can do that. You can manage that without too much trouble if you can keep them on task. So first time I might dictate the words and have the students write them down on a piece of paper. Then I might put this list up on the board, or I might hand out the list and have them correct their spelling. So they're working on that aspect of it to start with. And then, once we've accomplished that, that would be our first repetition. The second time, after they've, I'd have them rewrite the words on a vocabulary card. And big one, I like the bigger index card so you can put more stuff on it later. And that acts as a second repetition. Then finally, I would have the students divide the cards into two piles. I'd say whip through these very quickly, and I'd say divide them into the words you know and the words you're uncertain of. And that can help them to start thinking about the meaning of the word and what they know and what they don't know. And then the fourth thing I might have them do is get a learner's dictionary. You know, the standard dictionary is usually not very useful because the language used to define the word is often more complex than the language than the word that they're defining. So I don't find this to be very useful, but I tell my students to get a learner's dictionary. Collins Cold-Build happens to be my favorite one. There are others. Longman has one, and many of the companies produce one. And so I recommend they get one of those to work with, and that's usually much more effective. Finally, you know, I have them test each other, and the testing part of it is very important because every time the student has to recall the word, that's going to be more powerful way of putting that into their long-term memory. And so the ones that they don't know, I just have them set those aside, and they can mark those cards and then come back and review those later. And that acts as a fifth repetition. I like to have them alternate. You know, they might want to start out showing their friend the word, and then see if their friend can define it. And then maybe the second time around, you can have them, if you want to challenge it a little bit, you can have them read the definition, see if their friend can remember the word. But the recall part is the most difficult and the most important. And then finally, for each class thereafter, I'll have them go back and we'll add a different part to the note card. So I might, you know, one session might talk about sentence in context, which is also very important for the semantic side of it, learning the semantic part of the word, where they have to come up, I do not let them copy from a dictionary. They have to come up with their own sentence using the word, their own example, or you know, have them write a story using the words, and that can often be a very good writing activity as well, and you can help them to correct that and to go through, make sure the grammar is correct. So anyways, those are just a couple of ideas that I use when I'm teaching vocabulary, and hopefully there's some ideas there that you might want to do. The second idea that I keep in mind when we want to help our students to learn is we want to encourage as much as possible depth of processing. In other words, the more they have to think about the word, the easier it's going to be for them to recall it. And again, this is kind of, I think, kind of common sense. Students don't like this idea because they don't like to work that hard, but it's based on a lot of good research. And probably the most famous study is by these folks, Craig and Lockhart, and they did quite a bit of studies about how information is processed when we receive it, and how we can remember it. And as we've already said, the deeper the processing, the longer it's going to last in people's memory. So they named 3 levels of encoding, in other words, 3 levels of remembering. And the first level is structural, where it's very shallow. And this would be typically just looking at the word. What does the word look like? You know, how is it spelled? You know, that kind of thing. It's strictly the structure of the word. And the next level they talk about is phonemic, when the auditory part of learning the language comes in, and that's another area. But it's the phonemic part actually takes more effort. It takes more processing on the part of the learner, and so it's going to be more helpful to them in terms of remembering the word. And then last but not least, they talk about semantic language, or the semantic side of it, very deep processing when we have to relate to information that we already have, and that's going to be the one that's going to be the most effective. Here's a helpful chart from our friends at Cengage Learning, and you can kind of see an example there of what, in this graph they're using a question to try and elicit this kind of processing, depending on what you do. So you just kind of see an example of how we might use those questions with our students to get them to work harder and to think more deeply about the language. So, again, we want to do everything we can to encourage our students to process the language more deeply. Now, how do we go about that? There's some other ways that we can do that. One way is elaboration, where we try and link information with what we might, other information or things that we already know. And this is where, when you can dialogue with your students and you get them to think of examples of the word and how we might use it, this kind of thing. Writing sentences or stories is a very useful tool in bringing about that kind of elaboration. And this is my one thing. I kind of have fun with this, and sometimes students do. Sometimes I think it's stupid, but it really works. Is visual imagery. And so what I'll ask my students to do a lot of times is when they're looking at a list of words, I'll say, okay, I want you to imagine a picture in your mind using this kind of word. And the scene has to be as vivid as possible. So, for example, let's go back. Let's say we're talking about the word safe, okay? Now, how might I ask students to visualize that? Well, they have to come up with their own image. But just for example, you might say something like this. You say, well, you could picture, most students will go, okay, I'll picture a safe, like I put money in. So they think of this little black safe sitting on a desk or something. No, that's not what we want to do. We want to make it vivid. So I'd say, no. Make it a rainbow-colored safe, and when you open it, a unicorn flies out. Now that would be a vivid image. And believe me, you'll remember that word. So, and then if you want to get the other meaning of the word, you might include something like this. You might say, imagine yourself when you put your money in there and you remember that your money is safe. So taking that extra step can make the difference between them having to spend a great deal more time over this or not. And thirdly, they talk about self-referent encoding, which is just a fancy word for somehow relating that word to yourself. So especially if you can imagine yourself in that picture, in that mental picture, and use it that way, that's always going to be more helpful in remembering the words than just doing. Now, what technique or what strategy do most students use when they're trying to learn vocabulary? Automatically. What do you see most people do? What do you do when you want to memorize a list of things?
Well, if I'm teaching myself the word, I'll look in the dictionary and I try to remember where it is on the page on the dictionary.
Oh, well, you're visualizing. So that in itself, that's a very good strategy. But I would say, by and large, the majority of students just use repetition. And that's probably the least effective way of processing it. So I try and get them beyond that and try and encourage them to use these kind of strategies to make the language more meaningful and have a richer mental picture of what it is. And it takes a little more time at the beginning, but as you go along, it definitely makes a big difference. In fact, some of the research that I've read says that if we can train students to use even a few simple strategies like I've just talked about here, they can double the number of words that they can keep in their long-term memory. And if you want to check this, I tell students, test it out yourself. You don't believe me, you don't think it's worth your time, I say, list one, why don't you go ahead and use imagery with that one. List two, do repetition, see which one you do better on. And I'll bet you, at the end of the day, what they walk away with is, the enriched part is going to be much easier to recall, and they'll get better test grades. So that usually encourages them to go along. Now, another thing that we can use another strategy that we can use to help our students is intervals. And if any of you here took an introduction to psychology class, you may remember this. But in terms of memory and learning, the three issues that we come up with are whether or not the student can recall it, whether they can recognize it, and then how long does it take them to relearn what they've already forgotten. And do you remember this gentleman, Ebbinghaus? Anybody remember this guy? This is what he looks like if you've forgotten. Okay, kind of scary. Herman Ebbinghaus. So in the 1800s, this guy was the most dedicated researcher I've ever heard of. He wanted to test pure memory, so he sat down and he came up with something like 14,000 consonant, vowel, consonant combinations that were meaningless. And he did the meaningless ones because he wanted to just test, not as associations or any interference from anything else, but just the pure unit. And so he would go through and drill himself on these word combinations over and over and over again. And then he would find out how long it took him to forget the words and then to start over. Now, this is really striking because if you look at this chart here, you can see after your students have learned a list of words in class, within the first 60 minutes, the first hour after class, they've forgotten an incredible, they've forgotten over 50% of what they've learned. And then they have to try and relearn it the next time. And the length of time that it takes to relearn those words is critical as far as them making progress. So Ebbinghaus here, because they still use this chart today. This is kind of the standard thing for memory and recall and that kind of thing. So what we can do with this is, if you look at this forgetting, this curve of forgetting, is my suggestion is, if you can get students the first day after they learn the vocabulary to review the words quickly every hour. Just every hour, just go through the card, and review them. And as I said, the more, even though repetition is not the preferred method of processing those words, repetition does have an impact on how long it takes you to relearn the words. So in other words, if people do 10 repetitions and then and someone else would do 20 repetitions, the 20 repetition person would be able to relearn the words much more quickly than the 10 repetitions person would. So from that point of view, repetition is okay, and you can do this. So here's the difference. We talked about whether or not it's productive or receptive vocabulary. You can see the difference between these two. And this is where people get confused sometimes, because you think, as far as recognition goes, see, they retain quite a bit. But if we're talking about recall or productive vocabulary, that slope is very steep. So, but what we're interested in is not just recognition, but we want them to be able to have productive vocabulary. That's really our goal. So, as you can see, there's a big difference between those two things. So what could you do? Well, like I said, the first time, the first day they encounter the list, I say, quickly review the cards, and then the second day, just review 4 times, once before bed, okay? I still do it before they go to bed. And you can really see the difference in the scores. Like, when students take my test, which I don't think is all that difficult, but it's half matching and half, this is the test I use. It's a kind of like a Polynesian thing. It's just matching the meaning to the word. This section they usually do very well on, but when they go to this part where they have to figure out which word goes in the blank for the story, this one they do very poorly on. And so I always ask them, well, what did you practice the way I said? And if they get less than 80%, then you can tell them you're not studying enough. You need to put more time into it, you need to use more elaboration, you need to use more repetition if you want to get your score up. So, and that's usually a pretty effective guide. And I usually let them retake the test if they do less than 80% on it. That's kind of the standard. With this learning curve, you're going to forget some things. So you got to be realistic. So they're not going to remember 100%, but we can get them to do better. And also remind them that cramming is really a waste of time. Yes?
I was curious, how long after you've introduced the words do you actually do the test? Having the retention and the recognition in mind, what's the period between introducing the words and actually testing them on those?
I test every week, once a week. So I give them 7 days to cover 60 words, usually, is the way I go. And I want them to finish the list by the end of the semester, so that's my goal. So that's just me, but, you know, so, yeah.
Is this a purely vocabulary class? Is that all that's?
No, it's a reading class.
Reading
So
class.
we're doing other things as well, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But I have taught just vocabulary classes, so it's easier to focus, but, yeah.
Did you say 60 words in 1 week? I'm sorry.
That's right, yeah, that's my goal. Yeah, because if you look at the academic word list, it's divided into 60-word segments. I think the first list has 51 or something like that. So using that list, you can quickly go through and cover that material. Anyways, we can talk about that. And like I said, training learners to use cognitive-based learning strategies makes an enormous difference in their productivity and their ability to remember. And so when we talk about learning strategies, most researchers divide them into 3 categories. This is Shamat and O'Malley. They did this study, and they said, you know, they studied learners, and they said, well, what strategies do you use when you're learning vocabulary, you're trying to memorize things, what do you do? And so by the student's self-report, these are the things that they came up with, that there's metacognitive skills, which is the planning or thinking about the learning process, the cognitive skills, where you're manipulating the language or making some kind of a change, and then the social aspect of it, where you're encouraging each other and you're getting clarification and you're trying to do as well as you can, and oh, I didn't get this, did you get it, that kind of thing. So those are the learning strategies that these guys focus on. Here is a list of strategies that they used in a real-world study, and these are all cognitive-based skills. Okay? So they're going to be the deepest kind of processing by using this list. And what they did was they sat down with the learners and they said, look, we're just going to sit down with each student for 15 minutes, and we're going to give an example of each of these 9 strategies, and then we're going to send you off to do your thing. And then they had a control group that they just said, study anywhere you want, just do whatever you usually do. And the outcome of the study was, the test scores were strangely almost the same, but the difference was the test group actually remembered, they were able to remember double the number of words that the non-trained group had. And they were able to retain it after 1 month. They retested them, they still retained the vocabulary. So just a few simple strategies, 15 minutes, made all of it, they could double the amount of vocabulary that they could learn just following some of these strategies. And they didn't direct them, they didn't say, you have to do this strategy or that strategy. They just said, do whatever, use something from this list is what they said. So highly effective and very, very useful. Another strategy that sometimes comes up and it's gotten a lot of research press is the keyword strategy, okay? And there's kind of 2 different versions of the keyword strategy, but it's the point is to activate the semantic fields that people have. In other words, the schema, the things that people link to when they think about something. So if I say taxi driver or taxi, you probably immediately have all these images rush into your mind. Having your baby in a taxi or whatever it is. So, but if we can use this to expand our students' vocabulary, and this one is very useful for individual study. So what typically they would do in the keyword strategy, they would tell their students, well, let's say I want the student to learn the word rage. Okay, I would find a keyword that is probably a more high-frequency word like anger. Okay, rage is a lower frequency word, and anger is a higher frequency word. And then along with that, I would give them an additional 3 words that are synonyms that basically have the same. Fury, ire, indignation. And then they learn these words together, and there'll be activities. They'll do things like substitution type exercises and fill in the blank and this kind of thing. And this strategy has actually turned out to be very, very useful as well, and has a very high rate of success with learning a lot of vocabulary quickly. So it's another one that you can keep in mind. Last but not least, we'll finish with this one. I want to encourage you to take advantage of some of the online tools that are available. And I have a couple here that I find useful, that I use all the time. And let me just switch over here. Here's a sample. Here's a site where you can find AWL tests. Here's another one with heaps of activities and exercises with the academic word list. Here is the source from Avriel Coxhead, who's the person who came up with the academic word list or refined it. And you can download all the stuff here in PDF for you to use. Here is another site that it's a highlighting tool where you can paste. You can take a sample from one of your texts, paste it in here, and it will show you what all the AWL words are in that selection. So very useful, and you can use that to turn that around, and you can use it to make other activities with it. And here is a nice site that I find very useful, random.org. You can enter, this is useful when you want to scramble the words, because a lot of the lists come in alphabetical form, and so you can paste them in here and it will scramble them or randomize them, and then you can use them for all kinds of different activities based on that. And then last but not least, I find this to be a useful site that's Design 215. It's a word list maker. It will pull out all the unique words in a text and give you a list. So this one as well is useful. Now, I didn't make copies today because I believe in saving the planet. So what I'd like you to do is if you'd like a copy of this presentation and my bibliography, could you just drop me an email, and I'll be happy to send you this in PDF. And you can, let me give you my email address here, which I think is on the next slide. Should be, supposed to be. Okay, there it is, wrl@hawaii.edu. And I'm always interested in any ideas or research you might have in this area, so if something comes up and you're interested, please feel free to share, or we can converse about that. I'd be happy to do that. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time and the energy.